Today's prerequisites will be installing Docker Desktop and Visual Studio Code. I want to call out especially that Docker Desktop is probably going to be the most environmentally complex prerequisite we've seen so far in this selection of exercises. So if you need to spend your entire non-zero day setting up this particular prerequisite, then that's completely appropriate. For this environment that I'll be showing you on, it'll be a Windows 10 Professional install. In this exercise, we'll be playing with Docker, and as a result, we'll create some container images. First things first, let's create a directory for playing, and let's open a PowerShell terminal to the relevant directory. We want to make sure that Docker was correctly installed and is actively running. To do that, you can just type Docker, and it should provide you a list like this, list of commands you can pass. If this doesn't pop up, if you get a sort of error, I'd stop the exercise now and try to debug that. That'd be the first thing to start with. Docker's functioning. Let's go ahead and issue our first Docker command. Docker pull. We're going to pull an image that already exists and is hosted on Docker Hub. Let's pull Alpine. It's a Linux distribution, so we'll pull that down. Looks good, we've got it pulled down, and let's make sure that that's pulled down by looking at our local images. It's Docker images, and then -A just to grab everything. And we see that we now have Alpine locally. So we have an environment here that we've pulled down, the container image that defines an environment with some code or what have you. And now we want to be able to run that. To do so, we will do Docker run, and then the tag, which is Alpine, with latest being the version we've pulled down. That's implied when you don't provide it. And note that nothing happened visibly when we ran that. We can look at the running processes, Docker PS, to see that in fact it did start that image, it started a container from that image. And it exited right away because there was no one attached to it. So let's go ahead and clean up our environment and then try that again, but this time attached to it. Docker RM, that allows us to either pass this container ID, or since we're in PowerShell, we can just pass it Docker PS AQ, and that'll just clean up every image that or every container that we've got in our processes. We can get away with that now because we've got a mostly clean environment. And then we can Docker run -IT Alpine. This -IT argument, that's telling Docker that you want to attach to the container process that's starting up. There's more documentation on exactly what that argument is doing, but for the purpose of this exercise, that's enough to know that you're just attempting to attach to the container that's being started up. The following thing that you might note is we're no longer in our Windows environment. We've got this little indicator here. We're now in a Linux environment. We're in Alpine. And as such, you can run some Linux commands. I just ran ls. I can also run top. And you're seeing something that you might otherwise see not on Windows. Control-C to exit that. And then you can just type exit at any point, and it'll take you back to the Windows terminal. And then once again, if I look at Docker PS -A, Alpine was started up, that container, and it is exited. We're going to once again clean up our environment. To do that, we can just do that, and we'll see Docker PS -A. Excellent. And moving forward, we're going to be doing Docker run --rm in order to force the container to clean up on exit. The next thing we're going to want to do is open Visual Studio Code to the directory that we've created for today's exercise. I'm doing that with code dot, and that just says current directory. And here we are. We'll want to create a new file. We'll name that Docker file. That's actually a key name in Docker. You can name it other things, but then you have to pass an argument. If you do Docker file, if you can get away with just one file in that directory, then that is an implied variable that gets passed into Docker in certain commands and workflows. Within this new Docker file, we're just going to type one line from Alpine. Now let's navigate back to our terminal instance. So the next section is going to cover what is building and running a Docker file. So we're going to build an image from our very extensive Docker file, and then we're going to run it. To build it, we do docker build. Note, we're in the directory that contains this file. I'll actually show that a different way. We have our Docker file here. We'll do docker build -t to apply a tag. So I think non-zero image. And then we have to give context of the directory that has the Docker file, in this case, current directory. You'll note it already had that Alpine image, so it just applied that into the image that we're attempting to build. And if we look at Docker images, then we see non-zero image has now been a part of that. And then as you might expect, it's docker run -it -rm non-zero image, and we can run in our image once again. So we can now iterate on this Docker file and go through this sort of process of build and run to be able to see those changes manifested. I'm going to exit out of here, clean up, and move forward. For this next part, I'm going to want to revisit a previous exercise, which is basic Flask. And I'm going to want to give it a twist utilizing Docker. So make an image using the product that we had of this exercise. If you already have that code pulled down, we can go ahead and use that. I'm going to clone it just to show that workflow once again. So we'll do a git clone of that. And then we can hop into basic Flask, and we can open that up in code and look at that. We want the app.py and the message of the day text. We're going to go ahead and copy those over to our Docker repository. That's our new directory we created for today. And then relevant to this code, I don't want to go too far into what is this code, but I know we will need to make a change to this line here. We're going to have to utilize the host argument, simply because we're going to be operating from within a different context in the Docker file. So we'll just add host equals 0.0.0.0 there. Once we've got that, we're ready to move back to the Docker file. Let's take our terminal back to the Docker directory that we created for today. Clean that up. We'll be ready to build and run here again. And over here, we're going to change this Docker file. Don't need that anymore. So relevant to Docker Hub, there is an image that, or a selection of images that have Python pre-installed. That is the Python image. So I'm going to start there, and then I'm going to walk through the portal, the Docker Hub portal, and show what our selection of tags is. Let's do that now. All right, this is Docker Hub. And if you want, you can hop on hub.docker.com and search for Python. Python comes up first here. This is just a selection of images that happen to have Python pre-installed. Let's find a lightweight one. 3.10 looks like they're still coming out with candidates at this point. So 3.91 looks like a viable candidate for us to select, so long as our Python code is compliant with that. Pretty simple Python code, so that should be viable. And I think we can just pull 3.9.1 Alpine. That'll be fine. That's the one we'll choose. So we'll put colon 3.9.1-Alpine. And if we go back over here, docker build -t non-zero image, and a period to indicate the current directory, you'll note that it's going to start pulling that image down, and that'll be our image now. If we run it --rm to clean up non-zero image. The only difference is we're now in an Alpine instance that has Python installed, and it runs Python right away. Back at the Docker file, let's go ahead and start adding some stuff. We need our code, so we're going to add the current directory's contents. We could add specific files. We could specify app.py or message of the day.txt. In this case, I'm just going to do that. So that's saying I'm going to add the current directory's contents to the code directory. Note this will definitely be overzealous because it will pick up the Docker file as well. You can do a Docker ignore file just as you can with like a git ignore. So if you wanted to, you could specify a Docker ignore files in here that you don't want Docker to pick up. And then further, let's set the working directory to be our /code that we've now put all our code in. Then we're going to want to install our requirements, which in this case are Flask. If you have a requirements text and you're familiar with Python enough to know what that is, you can run that here as well because it'll pull the requirements text in. And then we know that because we're a Flask app, we want to expose the port 5000. And then finally, the command to be run once we enter the environment. You'll remember it ran Python right away. We're going to change that up a little bit. We're going to say, hey, I want you to run Python app.py. So this will become, I didn't add a space. This will become Python app.py on startup. So let's do that next. Let's do docker build. In fact, I think I can just go ahead and scroll up and use the last command I sent. We've got that. Cool. Let's docker run -it--rm non-zero image. And now we have our Flask app running. Now I'm going to try and navigate to localhost 5000/message of the day, which was the endpoint we created on the previous iteration when we did this before. And I suspect it's not going to work. Now, why would that be? Well, Docker has its own network. And it says, hey, I'm not letting just anything out. You have to tell me what you want out. So next, we're going to go back in there. We're going to use a new argument we haven't used as of yet. We're not going to have to rebuild the image, but we are going to pass the ports. So in this case, we can add 5000 to 5000. Let's change it up a little bit. We have the host side, so that's the side you and I are going to interact with, and the container side, which is the side Docker cares about. We know the container side needs to be 5000. In fact, it just told us so. But for our side, let's do something wacky. Let's do 50-50. Still says 5000, because in the Docker context, that's accurate. But over on our side, we have a happy non-zero month. In conclusion, we learned about Docker Hub. We distinguished between running containers and image definitions. We built and ran images, and we cleaned up container processes. And we built a Docker file. If you have additional time, you might consider reviewing the docs on Docker Run and Docker files. Those are linked below. Or you could iterate over past exercises beyond the Flask iteration that we did today to create Docker files for those. If not, congrats on your non-zero day.